Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u emisiju Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Od početka blokade Katara sredinom 2017. godine, Ankara je jasno i nedvosmisleno stala na stranu Dohe. Od tad, trgovinska razmjena između te dvije države konstantno raste. Turkey Katar Expo jedan je od najznačajnijih trgovinskih sajmova ovdje u Dohi. Turske firme izvoze prehrambene proizvode i tešku mašineriju u Kataru, dok Katar izvozi ukapljeni plin i naftne derivate Turskoj. Kako bismo bolje shvatili dubinu odnosa Turske i Katara, došli smo u Dohu, gdje se održao drugi sajam tursko-katarske trgovine. Nakon izbijanja zaljevske krize, Turska je bila jedna od rijetkih zemalja koja je Dohi odmah priskočila u pomoć. U prvim sedmicama blokade, teretnim avionima je dostavljala prehrambene proizvode Kataru. Kasnije je to činila brodovima. Kao poruku katarskim susjedima, Turska je poslala i nekoliko stotina vojnika u svoju bazu nedaleko od Dohe. Zatvaranjem saudijsko-katarske granice otvorile su se mogućnosti turskim kompanijama da povećaju izvoz u Katar. U cilju dodatnog jačanja bilateralne trgovine, Udruženje poslodavaca dviju zemalja odlučila su organizovati godišnji sajam trgovine, poznat kao Turkey Katar Expo. Katarski ministar trgovine i ekonomije izrazio je nadu da će dvije države uskoro potpisati preferencijalne trgovinske sporazume.
Nakon što je blokada počela, broj turskih kompanija koje rade u Kataru se povećao. Nakon početka opsade, registrovano ih je više od 40, uz 400 koje su i ranije radile u Kataru. Zabilježeno je veliko povećanje trgovinske razmjene. Krajem 2017. dosegnula je $1 milijardu. Očekujemo da će u ovoj godini biti još veća. Više od 120 kompanija učestvuje na ovom sajmu. Veliko interesovanje iz Turske i iz katarske strane, da se ta saradnja unaprijedi i bude još veća, naročito nakon što se potpišu neki preferencijalni trgovinski sporazumi koji su u pripremnoj fazi.
Na sajmu je predstavljeno 7 glavnih industrija, od građevinske preko prehrambene do vojne opreme i teške mašinerije. Sajam je posjetilo blizu 10.000 ljudi, što ga čini jednim od najznačajnijim u toj državi, a katarske i turske firme potpisale su ugovore vrijedne $60 milijuna. U prva 4 mjeseca od izbijanja diplomatske krize, turski izvoz za Katar porastao je za 90%, ali zbog zatvaranja saudijske granice, roba se mora prevoziti znatno dužim morskim rutama i zato su cijene proizvoda porasle za nekih 4%.
Mi vidimo Katar kao velikog poslovnog partnera, naročito sada nakon što su se politički odnosi Katara i Turske podigli na veći nivo. Poslovna klima nam je sada veoma naklonjena i postiče poslovne ljude poput nas da dođemo ovdje i poslujemo s Kataranima. Da istražujemo nove poslovne mogućnosti i prilike za investicije, kako u Kataru, tako i u Turskoj.
Katarska vlada je investirala blizu $450 milijuna u izgradnju ogromnih skladišnih objekata za hranu i druge životne potrepštine. Luka Hamad u Dohi je prometnija nego ikad, jer teretni brodovi direktno pristižu u Katar umjesto u Dubaji kako je ranije bila praksa. Do 2024. godine Katar namjerava proizvoditi 70% vlastitih potreba za hranom. Na sajmu se govorilo i o Bosni i Hercegovini. Veliko je interesovanje među katarskim državljanima za ljetovanje, ali i investicije u BiH. A ova tursko-švicarska firma gradi luksuzne vile za turiste iz Katara i drugih zemalja Arapskog zaljeva.
Mi smo u BiH registrovani kao Dido DOO i radimo na nekoliko projekata, pretežno na gradnji vila. Mi smo švicarsko-turska firma, zato smo došli na sajam u Kataru. Zadovoljstvo nam je što možemo predstaviti Bosnu i Hercegovinu ovdje. Sajam je, kao što vidite, itekako prometan, a naša firma je jedina iz Bosne. Naš cilj je predstaviti ljepote Bosne i Hercegovine katarskim državljanima. Kao što znate, proteklih godina raste interesovanje za Bosnu i Hercegovinu među zaljevskim zemljama, naročito među Kataranima.
Turska i Katar imaju dugu historiju bivanja na istoj strani regionalnih konflikata i razvoja događaja. Obje zemlje su pružile podršku egipatskoj revoluciji i osudile vojni puč kojim je trenutni čelnik te države Abdullah Al-Arian došao na vlast. Obje države odbijaju klasificirati muslimansku braću i Hamas kao terorističke organizacije, a podržali su pobunjenike koji se bore da svrgnu predsjednika Bašara al-Asada u Siriji. Katar i Turska također slijede sličnu strategiju balansa u odnosu sa Iranom. Njihovo partnerstvo u regionalnoj politici dobilo je dodatnu snagu nakon što je katarski emir šejh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani iskazao snažnu podršku turskoj vladi i predsjedniku Redžepu Tayyipu Erdoğanu tokom i nakon neuspjelog puča u julu 2017. godine. Detaljnije o ulozi Turske na Bliskom istoku, ali i istočnoj Africi u razgovoru koji slijedi. Professor Abdullah Al-Arian, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera Balkans. Let me start by asking you, since the crisis began, Turkey and Iran have significantly increased their trade with Qatar. How would you assess Doha's current relations with Ankara and with Tehran?
Well, I think that they found a number of points on which they can, share interests and also find a lot of common ground. I think given the way that the blockading countries have conducted themselves and developed their policy in terms of viewing other countries, whether it's Qatar directly, because it's the country that's being blockaded currently, but also because of its supposed relations with Iran and because of the kind of complications in the Saudi-Turkish relationship over the last few years and the jockeying for leadership in the region, that I think that all of the consequences of the blockade has had is that it actually has turned Qatar's relationships with some of its other neighbors into being far more stronger and being reaffirmed. But we know, of course, that this also has a history and that Qatar has also been pursuing these relationships for some time, specifically with Turkey, which of course has established a military base in Qatar, and they see eye to eye on a number of issues having to do with the Arab revolutions going back to 2011.
Now, how significant was Ankara's military support to Doha?
Well, I think it was quite crucial in those early stages. I mean, if we go all the way back to...
Did it avert a bigger crisis, perhaps? Yeah.
Yes, quite possibly, because I think that there were some signals that there could have been a escalation and perhaps even a military intervention on the part of the blockading countries, and that was prevented not necessarily by the presence of a US military base in Qatar, but rather by the decision of the Turkish parliament, which, in an emergency session basically passed a resolution in which they pledged 5,000 troops to be deployed to Qatar, and I think that this was seen in many ways as a way to avert a deeper crisis, because it certainly caused Saudi Arabia and the other blockading countries to recalculate their decisions in terms of how far they're willing to escalate in this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Now, Turkey has very strong trade relations with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. I think Turkey's trade with Saudi Arabia is about $8 to $9 billion a year. How is Ankara managing to balance its relations between Doha on one side and between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi or Dubai on the other side?
Well, I think Turkey has found itself in a position of strength regionally over the past decade or so, especially. The more that it's become kind of invested in some of the geopolitical crises and conflicts, the more it's found itself in a way able to balance some of these conflicting interests. And in this regard, I think, given what we've seen, for instance, from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in the way that he's dealt with other regional leaders, whether it's the leader of the Palestinian Authority or the Prime Minister of Lebanon or prominent businessmen within Saudi Arabia or even in Jordan and elsewhere, that there's a very different calculation made when they deal with Turkey, because Turkey, of course, is a much stronger power and can't be sort of bullied in the same way that we've seen some of these other countries. Mm-hmm. So I think that this has allowed Turkey to create the room and the space to maintain those relationships with the blockading countries while at the same time strengthening its ties with Qatar as well. And this, of course, comes from a position of strength.
Now, this is not the first crisis within the GCC. The last crisis lasted for about 8 months. What, in your view, lies at the crux of the problem?
Well, I think that this goes to the heart of what kind of future all of these Gulf states envision in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings that began in 2010, 2011. As we've seen, of course, there was a revolutionary movement, a current that existed in a number of different states. That was supported largely by Qatar, especially when we start talking, post-revolutionary transitions, supporting groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and its various affiliates and political parties. On the one hand, supported by Qatar and Turkey, but then on the other hand, of course, we see that a number of countries led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had a very different future in mind, one that would take us back to the authoritarian ways of the pre-revolutionary period. Installing, authoritarian leaders that were going to clamp down on any kind of, popular sovereignty or legitimacy that was achieved in ways that was purely through force on their societies. And we see this, of course, most prominently with the sponsorship of the coup in Egypt. the support for the civil war in Yemen in terms of the different parties, the support for the military dictatorship potentially taking effect in Libya. And I think on all of these issues we see that the two sides are diametrically opposed and they have a very conflicting view of what the future of the region should look like. And in the matter of the 2014 diplomatic crisis among the GCC countries, I think one of the main differences then versus now is, of course, you had a US leader at the time who, for all of his many faults and policies that, of course, are quite problematic in the region, was nonetheless not interested in an inter-GCC conflict to escalate to that degree. And so following their withdrawal of their ambassadors and attempting to begin the initial phases of a blockade, that was immediately reined in and the crisis was averted. But then fast forward to 2017, and of course you have a very different president in the White House. And he actually helped sort of pour gasoline on the conflict. He encouraged and gave the green light to the Saudi new leadership to be able to push forward and escalate very quickly. And so I think that's been the main difference between the two various approaches to this crisis, and one in which the US becomes much more of a destabilizing force rather than attempting to kind of maintain a certain status quo.
Is Turkey, in your view, still a model Muslim majority country?
I think in many cases we try to establish something like a model coming out of Turkey, but I think what the revolutionary moment has shown us in the Arab world is that the model can't be very easily applied. I mean, if we're saying by a model Muslim country that because they've sort of achieved power as a Muslim or Islamic, let's say Islamically oriented political party in a democratic way, that was certainly seen as being something that could be emulated in places like Tunisia, Egypt during its brief opening, and perhaps even elsewhere. The reason I think it hasn't succeeded in those places is because none of those states had deeply entrenched democratic institutions. And so simply saying that you can just go the path of elections as the Muslim Brotherhood did in Egypt through the Freedom and Justice Party was seen as very short-sighted, because it didn't address some of the much deeper structural flaws within the political system there. That includes things like the strength of the military, that includes things like the control of the intelligence agencies, the oligarch class that was very heavily linked financially and economically with some of the old elites going back to the Mubarak era. And this was something that I think was quite short-sighted on the part of the different parties that thought that they could simply just engage in elections and that would be enough to replace. And so this is where I think the Turkish model is only somewhat partially helpful and doesn't necessarily take into account the local and the historical circumstances of many of these other states.
And in the last 2 years, Turkey has been opening up military bases in Qatar and Somalia. Now there are plans to develop the Suakin Island in Sudan to establish a commercial and a naval base. Is Turkey, in your view, a major player in Middle Eastern and African relations?
Well, it's certainly becoming that way. I mean, if the traditional view of Turkey is that it was always looking westward and looking toward Europe, I don't think that's been the case in the last 15 years. And so this is the product of a couple of different developments, one of which has to do with Europe's posture toward Islam generally and toward Turkey in particular in terms of its membership in the EU. And it's also internally a product of the rise of the AKP as a force that is thinking more globally perhaps, or maybe even just more regionally in terms of carving for itself a place within the Middle East, and maybe even in some ways achieving a historical role that it's always maintained. If we go back, to the early 20th century and Turkey's role, of course, as the seat of the Ottoman Empire. Not to say that this is a kind of neo-Ottoman moment, but certainly there's a historic relationship there that one can make the case was very unnatural in the way that it was ignored for such a long time. Following the establishment of the Turkish Republic, the turning away from
immediate neighborhoods.
Exactly, from its immediate neighborhood, I think was quite unnatural in a way. And so this in many ways is seen as a return to the kind of, the cultural, historical links that have been maintained for a very long time. And so in that sense, I would say that there is something to that. But at the same time, we shouldn't also ignore the very immediate strategic and economic considerations that are being made in the course of these kinds of expansions, especially when we're talking about things like establishing deeper trade links, but also the military bases that are being established, probably as a result more of very short-term strategic concerns on the part of what some of the other regional powers are doing as well.
All right, Professor Abdullah, it was a pleasure speaking to you.
Sure, thank you
so much.
U proteklih 10 godina vanjsko-trgovinska razmjena između Turske i Katara povećala se sa 25 miliona na $700 miliona. U istom periodu Katar je investirao 19 milijardi dolara u tursku ekonomiju, dok su turske građevinske firme ovdje u Kataru dobile ugovore vrijedne 14 milijardi dolara.
So Harry, once again, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera. Now, in December 2017, the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, wrapped up a six-nation tour of West Africa. Now, just how important are African countries to Qatar at this moment?
Well, they are important, and they're going to become even more important in the next few months and next few years as the effects of this embargo are being felt even more strongly by the Qatari population. And as I think the Qatari government and Qatari business starts engaging external partners, partners beyond the Arabian Peninsula and the immediate Middle East, in more intense ways. And you see that Qatar, of course, has already built up over the last 10, 15 years a strong relationship with a number of African countries. That number is going to be increasing, and part of the Emir's trip to West Africa was both to strengthen these old ties as well as to explore new ties, thinking of both commercial partnerships but also in ways in which politically a number of small African countries can collaborate with Qatar, a small Middle Eastern nation. Because of course what happened there last year with the imposition of the embargo on Qatar is very serious from the perspective of many other small and weak countries around the world. The precedent that a bigger country can just close its borders, stop all food and water and other daily imports from coming in, is a very dangerous precedent. And if Qatar were to be forced to accept those demands and to concede whatever it is that the four countries that are imposing the embargo are suggesting, then of course that would send a signal to other small countries around the world that they too could be victim of this kind of regional bullying if your neighbor happens to be a big state. And that's fairly bad news for you. So in that sense, I think that Qatar is reaching out, is trying to broaden those ties, is trying to use those networks within the United Nations, but also, for example, in the World Trade Organization, where Qatar is preparing a complaint against the UAE and against Saudi Arabia, essentially to say that these measures are discriminatory and that you can't just do that out of nowhere, unannounced, invoke national security, and that's it. And it's a case which lots of small countries, including in Africa, will be watching because they simply cannot allow this to be a precedent. So that's why that trip mattered, and that's why we'll see more of it in the next couple of months and years.
Right. Now, since the crisis began, Turkey and Iran have significantly increased their trade with Qatar. How would you assess the current relations between Ankara, Doha, and Tehran?
Well, they're certainly good, and I think that certainly from the perspective of Doha, Doha is extremely grateful for this kind of support. It's support that's not just useful, in many ways it's existential. When you had so much of, as I said, of your daily necessities coming across the border from Saudi Arabia or coming via the port of Jebel Ali in Dubai, switching from one day to the next is absolutely necessary because you need to keep the shelves full, you need to keep your economy running and your people well fed. So the fact that Turkey and Iran stepped in was crucial. Now, this being said, sometimes on the other side, this is portrayed as a kind of new emerging axis, as a new geopolitical force in the Middle East. Exactly. I am still a bit careful about that. And I'm careful about that because if you look at the pattern in the wider Middle East over the last 5 or 10 years, what you see is a pattern of very rapidly shifting and changing alliances.
Exactly. We talked about the Sunni bloc 3-4 years ago, and now it has basically collapsed overnight.
Precisely. And I think that we're going to see more of that. I mean, it's a characteristic of the particular moment we're in the international relations of the world, but particularly of the Middle East. Certainly after the kind of US withdrawal, the US increasingly unable and above all unwilling to provide the kind of security and the kind of political cooperation that historically it has provided. This means that, of course, these politics are increasingly frantic, that people are jockeying rapidly for short-term gain, but that there is very little long-term thinking about where real interests lie, where real partnerships can emerge. And I'm afraid that this is going to continue for a while to come, and that these alliances and these partnerships may change again. From the perspective of Turkey and Iran, Qatar at the moment is a good partner, is an expedient partner. But if tomorrow the government in any of those countries would change, or if there is a sudden opening because of Syria, or because of a dossier that, frankly speaking, to Iran or to Turkey is more important than Qatar, then Qatar may find itself somewhat superfluous. I think that Qatari policymakers would do well to remember that, and I'm pretty sure they do. As a small country, you cannot take the friendship of a bigger one for granted. But for the time being, of course, it's extremely useful to have those two partners commercially, but also politically, and in Turkey's case, militarily, present here and enabling Qatar to resist the demands of the four blockade-imposing countries.
Now, this is not the first diplomatic crisis within the GCC. What, in your view, lies at the crux of the problem?
Well, I think there's two things. Yes, on one level, indeed, there is a deep irritation in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi, particularly under the current leaderships, with not just the foreign policy, but even, I would almost say, the model of society that Qatar has been building. The fact that, certainly in a political sense, there is much greater freedom here than in either of those two neighboring countries is important. The fact that women have played such a prominent role in the construction of this country, in the running of this country, particularly, of course, Her Highness Sheikh Hamza, is an eyesore all across the border and in the minds of many people there. And when on top of that, you then see indeed from their perspective a foreign policy that is too independent, that is even outright rebellious, that defines its interests separate from the interests of Riyadh and of Abu Dhabi, that makes it indeed from their perspective particularly explosive. But at the heart, of course, this crisis is not just about Qatar. It is also about the domestic projects that are being undertaken in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates, over the last 10 years, has increasingly centralized power, political, financial, and military, in Abu Dhabi. This is a new situation. This is not the way the UAE used to operate. Before 2008 and before the financial crisis, you had all of the Emirates doing essentially their own foreign policy, their own economic policy.
There was a lot of power sharing.
An incredible amount of power sharing, and it was a very different view on the country internally and externally. That has now changed. The UAE really is Abu Dhabi, and Abu Dhabi is the UAE. And the current leadership of Mohammed bin Zayed wants to continue that trend of centralization, wants to also increasingly project power abroad. And from that perspective, Qatar is a rival, both because it has an alternative model of society and it has a different foreign policy. And the same thing, of course, applies to Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman, who is, as you know, gambling the bank domestically and internationally. Everything is up for grabs at the same time. He's trying to change the way the Saudi royals relate to their population and to the clerics. He's also trying to change, of course, the situation in Yemen, the situation with Iran. The relation with Israel is being reset, the other side of the Red Sea, Egypt. Everything is in motion there. And so what we're seeing is that this crisis is also an expression of the doubts, of the crisis of confidence, and of the internal struggles within those countries over who rules and what kind of model of society are we going to see emerging in the United Arab Emirates and in Saudi Arabia. And that means that in many ways what Qatar does is almost not terribly important to them. In many ways, I think we will only see an end to this crisis when something changes in those countries rather than necessarily something here. Because as I said, it's not just about Qatar. It's also very much about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Right. Now, we have seen Turkey opening up military bases in Qatar, in Somalia, and now there are plans for a new commercial and naval base in the Suakin Island in Sudan. Is Turkey, in your view, becoming a major player in the Middle East?
It certainly has that ambition, or certainly under the current president, President Erdogan, it has the ambition, it has long had the ambition to play this role. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've increasingly seen this projection of what some would call a kind of neo-Ottoman dream, rebuilding the historical sphere of influence of what the Ottoman Empire used to do, appealing no longer just to a narrow Turkish national identity, but a kind of pan-Muslim, greater Middle East kind of identity in which Turkey ideally is seen as a fairer broker than Saudi Arabia, comes with lots of baggage. Egypt's very weak at the moment, so the time is right. Iraq and Syria, of course, incredible internal issues. So the time is ripe from the Turkish perspective to reassert power and reassert influence. What I think is going to be the single biggest problem with this vision is that I think Turkey overestimates the extent to which it knows the societies to which it is returning and the extent to which it can shape events on the ground. It is one thing to sign a number of business deals or to do a number of high-profile state visits and even make announcements about police training and military academies, etc. It's a very different thing over in the longer term to build up sufficient information and sufficient networks to be able to really change politically the course of some of these countries. You can even ask this to people, for example, in the US State Department, who often have huge embassies, have decades of relations with certain countries, how difficult it really is to gain the long-term political allegiance of a country. Turkey is exciting at the moment because it is new. As, of course, Turkey's presence consolidates, as it has to stay there for multiple years, the number of opportunities in which Turkey can disappoint you by not giving you enough support or by not interpreting certain events in the right way will also increase. And here, inevitably, as I said, because Turkey still lacks a lot of the information networks and the depth of understanding of the societies where it is operating, it will be making mistakes. You already see this in part in Somalia, where it is in many ways overstretched, where an important part, not all, but an important part of the political establishment is increasingly skeptical, let's put it that way, of the Turkish presence and what Turkey really does for Somalia. Up to what extent does this benefit a handful of politicians and Turkish business elites as opposed to ordinary Somalis? And you'll see that arising in other places where Turkey engages as well. So it's a learning process. I think if the Turks are smart, they keep a relatively discreet profile. They invest, as I said, in their own capabilities, intelligence collection, the way their foreign service works, academic networks, business networks, that give you a much more durable and solid presence, rather than, as I said, these kind of high-profile, flashy things, which often don't really translate into long-term influence on the ground.
Great, Harry, thank you so much for speaking to us. It was a pleasure having you on Al Jazeera.
Great pleasure.
Bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju Granica Istoka. Cijelu emisiju možete gledati na našem web portalu balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.